What would happen if St. John Paul II got to sit down at a coffee shop with, let's say, the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger? What would that conversation sound like? Not just a debate, a tit for tat, an actual heart-to-heart conversation between these two people. Well, that's the subject of today's guest's doctoral dissertation, which I found extremely intriguing, and I thought, now this would be neat to have her on the show, discuss this. And so our guest today is going to open up this debate through the lens of love and responsibility, theology of the body, with this completely opposite perspective. How did Margaret Sanger get to where she was? This person that we just look at, this eugenicist, racist, pro-choice person, we completely villainize, but what's the human element of her that made her make those decisions? We're going to take a deep dive today. But before we jump in, I want to thank all of you patrons that make this whole show possible. At patreon.com/Jason Everett, we have a whole community of people who keep this show afloat, and by joining the community, you help us to grow the message, you're helping to support our family, and we'll give you a free swag, whether it's, free books and t-shirts and all kinds of stuff. If you sign up at $20 for the next week, we'll send you a free copy of the book we just came out with on gender called Male, Female, Other, A Catholic Guide to Understanding Gender. So you can get more details at patreon.com/Jason Everett. But without further delay, our guest today, Sarah Denny. She is an ethics professor at Loyola University in New Orleans. She has now a PhD in bioethics from the Regina Apostolorum over in Rome. She's taught at an all-girls Catholic high school, also been campus minister at Loyola State University, and is passionate about integrating the demands of medicine with the tenets of personalism, we'll learn more about that, and empowering young women with a deeper knowledge about their bodies. And so I would like to welcome to the show, Sarah. Thank you for coming with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, this is a neat subject matter. I mean, because a lot of times we just think, okay, John Paul II, Margaret Sanger, you couldn't get people that are more two polar opposites. And they didn't have an opportunity, in my understanding, to cross paths at any point. Sanger died, I think it was in 1966. John Paul was probably archbishop at that point in Poland. I imagine he may have been familiar with his work. I'm sure he was later on in his pontificate. But you have a kind of a neat journey going from like a women's studies gender class to ending up in bioethics and this subject. Tell us a little bit about you, your background, and this whole journey.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, I knew I wanted to work with women. And then when I started college, I was a biochemistry major and I was pre-med. And, like most people that age, I wanted to change the world. So I decided that I would go into medicine and probably specialize in obstetrics and gynecology. And part of that journey was that I decided to take a women's studies class my second semester. So this was January of 2008. And on the first day of class, we had to go around the room to introduce ourselves, and we had to say our name, our biological sex, and our gender.
And this is 2008.
2008. So,
Wow.
I mean, now I wouldn't be shocked necessarily at that question, but then I'd never heard that question. And I grew up going to, a Catholic high school and went to church every Sunday with my family. So I was sort of like, my little Catholic bubble was basically popped. And I was like, wait, what? And so that semester for me, I actually look at as one of the most important pivotal points in my life and my story, because the Lord was, he was allowing it in his mercy. Actually, I think it was a gift to me because it taught me so many things. Some of those including, number one, there's always room for dialogue, always, if both parties are willing to listen. And number two, that if I really want to speak to someone who has a different opinion than I do, then I must first listen to them. And so, but at that point I was 18 years old and I'm reading the stuff we had to read for homework. And some of it was a very, I think, intentionally, emotionally charged. And so I was kind of struggling with, well, gosh, this is getting kind of dark. Like, where's the hope for women? And one of my homework assignments was that if a man tried opening the door for me, I was supposed to say, no, I can do it myself. And so I remember raising my hand that day and being like, well, what if he's trying to be a gentleman? And I remember the teacher saying something along the lines of, well, that doesn't exist.
Wow.
And I learned the rest of that semester, if I could put it in few words, would be there was a lot of pain in that room, And listening more and more to the stories, I realized, women didn't just like wake up one day and decide to be anti-men. Like there's a reason why a woman is going to be, in a lot of ways, I think bitterness is the deepest seed that could be planted that has very deep roots and far-reaching effects. But anyway, so I was looking for anything that made me feel a little bit more encouraged than I was feeling. And a year before that, had been started being introduced to theology of the body through a local teacher at a boys' high school in our area, where we were doing campus ministry, co-ed nights, and things like that. So I started reading more of that. I started reading John Paul II's Letter to Women. I started reading his encyclical on women. And this was like in my free time that I would do this. And when I read it, I started to literally internally feel the difference in my own heart of there was peace. I couldn't necessarily explain to you what was happening, but the best way I can explain it would be, I felt that for the first time I was reading something about women and all of the things I was reading from the different perspectives. And when I was reading it, I felt permission to be myself. I felt that I didn't have to be one way, but that there was this wide open arena of possibility for all women, including me. Yeah. And so long story short, I think it was obviously the Holy Spirit, because I originally intended to change my major to women's studies. I was convinced I would change the program from the inside out. And thankfully, the Lord knocked me over the head. And that's not what I did. Instead, I was like, well, how do I learn more about women? Because I realized quite quickly, I don't know anything. I'm only 18. And I feel like the Lord was like, well, I made women. So how about you ask me? And so that is why I transferred, to study theology and philosophy. But I will say, to end that class that semester, and this is probably a good thing to share, would be, our final grade was dependent upon a final paper. And so I realized I need to find some kind of this middle ground, and I wanted to know if that was possible. So I ended up watching an entire season of The Bachelor in a week. And in that situation, I just wrote about the objectification of women and the importance of respecting women. And I got an A on the paper. And because of that, I realized, okay, so we're not necessarily on two different planets, but we're trying to find common ground. And apparently, if I can find ways to at least highlight that we both want women's dignity honored, we can have a conversation.
Yeah. No,
so that's what kind of started.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that's so often overlooked, that at the end of the day, people are often looking for the same goal. They just have different means to get there, and they assume because their means are different that the end is different. You know, so I think of like the stuff that we're writing about on gender. The goal is to support and care for the individual who experiences gender dysphoria so they can be their most authentic self. Yes. That's actually both of our goals. We actually have the same goal, but the means of what that looks like, because it's such a polar opposite, it's just like, okay, we have nothing in common. All we can do is kind of bicker and yell back and forth, and that's that. Yeah, exactly. So I think, it's a terrifying challenge, but it's also, it's ripe with possibility. I think it's in this cultural context that we're living in, the most important thing that we can do is to not give up hope in the potential for dialogue. Yeah. Now, in your studies, you're reading all these authors. I imagine Judith Butler and Simone de Beauvoir and Margaret Sanger and all this. So you're reading Margaret Sanger. Were they able to give you some of the backstory of her life, or was it more like her more current platform position without the backstory of where all of this came from? Because when you learn of Margaret Sanger's, upbringing as a Catholic and the family she was in and the hardships her mother went through, you see, okay, now I think I see where this is coming from. Do they discuss any of that, or it's just kind of like, nope, this is her position? So my intention was actually to go straight to the primary sources for Margaret Sanger. So I ended up reading, thankfully, a wonderful group of people. They had put together a bunch of her letters and her speeches and different notes that she would take in her journals. And I ended up reading through, it was a 4-volume work on the writings of Margaret Sanger. So I feel like I got to know more of her actual personality, as close as one can get a century later from that. But my goal was I wanted to know why. And granted, anyone who writes a doctoral dissertation, I'm sure, would say the same thing. You don't quite know what you're getting into until you're into it, But I felt like I needed to go to the person who ultimately came up in some way, shape, or form with this idea for a pill. And so I went all the way back to Margaret Sanger. Why were we even talking about birth control? What was the need back then? And, in the early 20th century, it was a completely different situation historically. And I think a lot of people don't
take the time to actually put themselves into that reality. And specifically what I mean is the different laws that existed at that time. One of them had been written and was encouraged to be written the way it was because the Postmaster General was a Protestant. I shouldn't say Protestant. He was a Puritan, and he really wanted to be able to emphasize the need for purity within people. But he did that so that in a way that the law was actually written so that anything that was related to a biological diagram of a woman's body, right? So I'm a Creighton model practitioner. Anything I would teach, let's say my students or my clients, that would have been considered illegal if I had tried to put it in the mail, because the way the law was written, it was considered to be pornographic material. And so that made it essentially illegal to be able to even talk to women about these things. And doctors were afraid to even give women this information because they didn't want to get arrested for it. Yep. Simultaneously, we also then lived in a time, if we go 100 years ago, to where it was difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to actually say no to her husband sexually, because it could have been grounds for divorce. And if I was living 100 years ago and my husband divorced me, I didn't have rights to the property or even necessarily to have my own children, right, to stay with me, or how am I going to make money? So a woman was in a particular way. I can see why Margaret Sanger would argue and see that some women felt completely trapped within marriage and within motherhood, not because marriage and motherhood are the evil, but because woman, once she was married, didn't necessarily have the same freedom that man had in her marriage or in the sexual sphere. And earlier when you were talking about there's always this place for, that we can come together, we have the same goal. That's what I would say I saw, was that ultimately John Paul II and Margaret Sanger both wanted freedom for women. And they both wanted women to be able to be exactly like the best version of themselves in a sense. That's like a current way we would say it. But truly, they wanted that. And so for Margaret Sanger, what she came at the table with was, here's my very stark reality that I'm living. I'm a nurse in the Lower East Side of New York City. I'm working with an immigrant population. The men are going to work during the day. The women have to work in the evenings. And even if her husband comes home and he's drunk and he wants to have sex, she can't really say no. And then she might have 7 kids and be 30 years old and be completely exhausted. And so her argument, believe it or not, when I was reading her writings, I did not find the support for abortion like people typically argue. I found her more so saying that abortion was a tragedy, that society was depending upon it. And she predominantly what she wanted, she was like, that's not the ultimate problem. The problem is we need to help women space their children. We need to help them not get to a place where they even want to have an abortion. And so she started with arguing for education, right? But through, I think anyone who's worked in education, it takes time. It's difficult. How are you going to access people? And so over a period of like 2 to 3 decades, I would say that vision went from education to, I want every single woman, no matter her socioeconomic status nor her education level, to have an option that allows her to be free, in the sense that her freedom means that even if she has sex, she can walk away without becoming pregnant. Because that's what a man can do. He can walk away. He's not going to get pregnant. And the one thing that seemed to be the common denominator amongst that is, here's the gift of science. And one thing it could do was to create a pill that they didn't really realize what it was doing. They just kept doing the studies, which we could talk about another time. They have horrible effects. And the studies show that they're really bad. But ultimately, the effect that they wanted, which is that most women weren't getting pregnant, was had. And so they pushed the pill forward. No, but that's over like 4 decades, multiple people, lots of scientists, the discovery of hormones, lots of different things come into play. But the point is that, I'm not here to canonize Margaret Sanger by any means, but I do think that there's quite a powerful potential to be able to sit across from her at a table. And honestly, I mean, I had an image, and it sounds sort of cheesy, but it's true. Like, I had an image in prayer one day when I started out this research, and I saw Margaret Sanger and John Paul II sitting across from each other at a table drinking coffee. And I was sitting like kind of in between them, like just listen. I was like the observer, And I have to tell you, when I was reading Margaret Sanger, there were days where I would have to close the book and walk away because I was like, emotionally, it was so heavy. I mean, because women would write her letters. She had thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of letters, so many letters that she had to hire people to respond to the women writing her, asking her for help of how can I please delay pregnancy because I can't have another baby right now. And so at that time, I remember one day I was like, come on, like, this is so ridiculous. Like, John Paul II, don't you have anything to say to her? Because, like, I don't know what to say to her. Come on. And I felt like it was like John Paul II kind of looked at me and he's like, nope, first we need to listen. Like, let her finish speaking. And so I had to sit there and, like, really give her a shot. And again, I think that our difficulty in the current culture is it's much easier to cancel people. I don't like what you said. Bye. Or it offends me, bye. Or it hurts my feelings, that means you don't agree with me, that means that you reject me. You can't do that, bye. The reality is Margaret Sanger's like everybody else walking around. She's a mixed bag. And now her eugenics stuff, I can 100% agree with you. That stuff was hard to read because it's very clear. But there was a different, remember that she was a woman, and like we talked about and you had mentioned and referred to before, she was a woman in a family. Her mother had multiple pregnancies. Her mother's tuberculosis was affected by those multiple pregnancies. Her mother died at a younger age than she needed to because she was exhausted and those illnesses were exacerbated. And Margaret Sanger had to step in that role as one of the older daughters to help take care of the other children. And she saw like woman's reality and she was fighting against it, and but for the grace of God, honestly, like, I'm like, if I were alive 100 years ago, sometimes I was like, dang, I mean, I might want to be her wing woman. Like some of the things she would write, it was just so insistent on giving women fair opportunities that, you can't read everything and say, no, I don't agree with that. Some things I genuinely agreed with, but it's a matter of being able to really give her due. And then we have the power. I have the power, like everyone else, to sift through what can I keep and then what do I need to let go. But also, regardless of whether I keep it or let it go, I can learn more about her as a person that then explains the beginning of a very powerful movement that even if, like now, Planned Parenthood wants to separate themselves from Margaret Sanger. But I'm like, even if you separate from her in name, you can't separate yourself from the work that she did was probably, I would say, the primary moving force of why we now have the birth control pill universally accessible to women around the world. And that's because of the work that she did.
Yeah. Now, let's say we've got that vision that you had in your head of St. John Paul II sitting in a cafe in Krakow, having a coffee with Margaret Sanger. And, he always had such a listening heart. I remember hearing one story that the details are foggy, but some woman who I think had left the church, I don't remember what the issue was given an opportunity through a friend of hers to have a sit down with John Paul II. And they had a long chat, and they were in a room together. And the woman who had been a fallen away Catholic, lost the faith, whatever, came out of the room just in tears. And the other person and was just converted. And the other woman, what did he say to you? What did he say to you? And the lady said, nothing. He's the best listener I've ever met in my entire life. That John Paul just received instead of just being like, pew, 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 like using his world-class intellect to just debunk the stuff. Like, and it wasn't just a show that he put on. Like, he genuinely was interested. He was one of the most well-learned people on the planet. I knew people that knew him well, and they said it was astonishing because he met with so many people from science, economics, military. I mean, you name it, the field of study. He was having daily conversations with these individuals over lunch, and they said it was crazy. Like, you could bring up any subject, whether it's like scuba diving or F-15 fighter jets or foreign diplomacy in Kenya, and he could talk for like a half hour on that subject. Precisely because he had not just this world-class intellect, but this heaven-sized heart of just to receive and to listen. So let's say we've got those two characters sitting at the table. Tell us about, I mean, it's kind of hard to narrow down a several hundred-page dissertation into a soundbite, but what does a conversation sound like?
Well, okay, I would start with, and honestly, comes back to you, Jason, and as a thank you to you, the book that you wrote with his 5 loves for John Paul II. I remember this was before I even started my doctoral program, and I was reading, I can't remember the chapter it was in, but it's when John Paul II looked at, I believe, a bishop who was asking him about making the gospel and the truth attractive. Yep. And he said, we must understand the soul of the woman. Mm-hmm. He said, premarital sex, contraception, and abortion. Have they liberated woman or have they enslaved her? Mm-hmm. And when I read that quote, I don't know how to explain it other than my life's work and mission felt solidified. You know, this man that I've never met, but I feel spiritually fathered by, was giving me just another, in a sense, like the flashlight to the next step. And I believe, honestly, that would probably be the statement that he could start with. And he would say it very gently, and he would say it very calmly. And he would look at her and he would ask her that question, because he would say, Margaret, I understand that you want freedom for women. And he said, and I understand why you took the path that you took to get to the pill, to get so that every single woman could have access, that she could walk away from the sexual act and she could be free, quote, free from the responsibility of parenthood, especially if she doesn't feel ready or able to carry a child. And he would say, but the key here is that woman, though she's equal to man, is actually the one who holds, in a sense, a very unique power. But with that power does come a great responsibility. So yes, men and women are equal, but no, they're not the same, you know? And the truth is that he would say, Margaret, you're right. Woman does have to hold a greater responsibility when it comes to sex, because she is the one who can potentially carry a child and become pregnant. And woman is the one who, in the first, especially the first few months of life, you know, if she's being, first of all, in utero, like as the child is growing, the demands are upon her body, upon her psychological health, upon her everything, her emotions, you know, her energy level, you know, and the child is born. Like the demands are great upon the woman in a way that man can empathize with and aid and help her in, but he cannot take the place of, you know. And I think one of the greatest points he would try to highlight is that, and this is what I was the most touched by in my research, is that John Paul II, he's not anti-sex, you know, he's not anti-woman's expression of herself or her creativity. He is not saying that woman to be wife and mother has to be this one narrow way. You know, but what he's saying is that woman, like man, because they're both human persons, have a very deep, deep, deep place that he would call, and we would recognize as the interiority of the human person, right? He referred to it as woman's personal subjectivity. And he said, and that is that deep place. Another word he referred to it in theology of the body is as the heart, right? That heart is the deepest place. You know, I can sit in front of anyone and I can try to relate to them what I feel and believe and experience in my heart. But at the end of the day, it's such a deep interior place of my personhood. The only person that can really access it is God, right? Is Christ, is the Spirit of God who can dwell within me, who dwells within me. And I think for John Paul II, when he would try to show Margaret, is that it's not that he doesn't understand why she would have run for someone discovering and creating the pill. It's that he would say, let's look at the fruits. He says, you know, you're a woman who had socialistic practices and you grew up in a certain sense through the Socialist Party, and you walked away from that because you felt like they weren't actually solving any problems. Like woman still wasn't being able to be met where she was. And I think he would challenge Margaret first, and he would say, Margaret, but look at the effects of the pill. You know, like the gift of the human person is that every single one of us, the dignity of the person is indestructible. You can't annihilate the person's dignity, you know, but what does the pill do to woman? In a certain sense, it makes us all the same, you know. Of course, I don't mean in every way, but in a certain sense, like it erases the great potential within woman, that her distinguishing characteristics that make her different than man aren't the thing that actually we look at it as the curse. He would say, Margaret, it's not the curse. It's actually the way. It's the way that woman becomes the most full version of herself. And he'd be very clear. He'd say, Margaret, I'm not saying that women have to have 20 children. I'm not saying that sex only exists for this biological reproductive capacity. Yeah, that's part of it. And he would say, and I'm not saying that I don't want women to experience pleasure in the sexual act. But his argument would be, Margaret, we don't want to divorce it to be one or the other. He said, because we can't separate the two, just as much as we can't separate the person apart from within their very selves. The woman is both body, woman is also soul, right? She's incarnated spirit. And so she and the depth of who she is as a human being, especially within the sexual sphere, her heart doesn't disappear in that act, you know? And he would say that if you want freedom for women, instead of giving them something that would ultimately eliminate for them the potential for human life and for pregnancy, he would say, give to them what you originally intended, which is information and knowledge. Give them the knowledge about their actual bodies, because their bodies are incredible and powerful and strong and have so much within them. And there's like the glory of God is man fully alive. And he would say the glory of God, that includes woman being fully alive. And I think he would just look at her all in love, then in all sincerity, and say, Margaret, what you didn't have, we now have, which is science has caught up to this question.
Yeah.
And women can know with confidence when they're fertile and when they're infertile. And that isn't just for the sake, again, of avoiding or achieving pregnancy. It's also a form of empowerment. Like he'd say, Margaret, I want women to be empowered just as much as you do.
Yeah.
But we can't do that by taking away this very unique but also powerful part of their personhood, right?
Yeah.
It would be, let's empower them so that they have the capacity to come to understand themselves more deeply on a biological level, which cannot be separated from their entirety as a human being, and that their heart would also be affected by those choices.
Yeah. Now, when I think of the history of feminism, I tend to think of kind of first wave feminism, meaning women need the same human rights as males, to own property, to vote, and so on. And so those first wave feminists were fighting for something very legitimate, of equality with guys in that sense. And then the second wave kind of took it off the rails a little bit and started to almost introduce this idea that in order to be equal to men, women somehow need to be masculinized in order to be powerful, and, that which dives into the sexual realm of sterilizing the sexual act. And I can imagine John Paul and Margaret, they're sitting there chatting, and her hearing these things and appreciating that John Paul, is giving her the benefit of the doubt of where these intentions were coming from. But in her, I could still feel something bristling in her when he says things about freedom and women having power, and then her thinking back to the situation at that time and being like, power, freedom, what about the mom who's there, working her tail off from morning till night to take care of 6 kids, and then her husband rolls in the door from work at 8:00 in the night after going to the bar, and he smells a little bit like alcohol, and he wants his maternal rights, and she's fried and burnt out and can't possibly mentally afford another kid. And you're telling me she has power? You're telling me that like there's freedom in this? Let's say she's now pushing back to John Paul II and saying, how is this freedom? How is this power? What is your answer, John Paul, to this poor woman where this guy comes back with no tenderness, with no regard for her in terms of the sexual act, and only is thinking in terms of his rights? How do we really protect the woman? And so now she's thrown that back at John Paul. Not having read your dissertation, I imagine you address, this type of tension that exists of, okay, if this isn't the answer, then what is to this lack of reverence in marriage that he has for her?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great question, because it really comes down to the point that, John Paul II was not ignorant of the power of history, and I think what I love about his writings, and as a woman, what I find so encouraging, is that he is consistently placing heavy and important demands upon the man, and I think that's where, he would be completely fine with and understandable for her emotions and her passion coming out and her anger. And I think he would look at her and say, you know what, Margaret, like, you're right. Like, in those situations, it's completely difficult and there's no going backwards. But he said there's always potential and hope for the future. And I think he would argue that that's the power of education, is if we can either stay and keep doing what we're doing, but how has that worked out for us? Yeah. What are the fruits of, for example, like what are the fruits of, in 2023, if they're having the conversation today, let's say, like, what are the fruits of the pill being, one of the most popular forms of medication that anybody can take? And you would say, what's it doing to our women? Like, especially what is it doing to our adolescent women? What about the effect on the central nervous system and the emotional development and the way that they see themselves, and the way that it's covering up some serious health issues that if they could have found out about it earlier, maybe could have been, diagnosed, and they wouldn't be struggling with so much infertility, right? Or what about the pill's effect on, fertility, things like that. But I think he would say, Margaret, then let's talk together about, like, tell me more of your stories, because he'd want to hear from her. And this was my sense, is that he learned not from her per se, but from the women and the men that he would listen to. He did also learn about what is man's responsibility in this situation, And my argument is that if we want to have these kinds of conversations, then we need to be doing an adequate job of sex education. And I think that's where he would point to, because when she first started, I think that's where she could understand with him, like, don't forget that, Margaret, don't forget where you started. Like, this is the harder way. Here's the deal, though. This is the harder way. It's not as quick as taking a pill, and that's the thing, is it's more time consuming. It's more of an investment. There's self-control involved, things like that. But I think he would take her back to her beginning and say, Margaret, I hear you, and I know why you're frustrated, and I know why you, in a sense, abandoned the education route. But now here we are a century later. What can we do to move forward? I think we need to recover the inspiration you had in the beginning,
Yeah.
And my argument would be, in light of both of them, that, sex education as we know it today, especially in the United States of America, we're typically used to it being either comprehensive sex education, the Planned Parenthood model. They have the best, most successful model, I would say, out there in terms of their reach every year. And then there's typically, the Catholic Church or Christian model of abstinence only.
Yeah.
And my dissertation focused in, how about we take these two thinkers and put them together to illuminate further what I would say is necessary, which is a third way for sex education, which I would call it an integrated model of sex education. So Margaret's argument was that the people need to understand science. Mm-hmm. And John Paul II would say they absolutely do. But, even looking at abstinence only, like I've worked with brides who then they get married and they've said no all their lives, and they're like, oh my gosh, so now it's okay. Like all of a sudden it's okay. And like it takes a while for their bodies to even get used to that, and their minds and all these things. And so where's the possibility and the potential to find between the two? And I think that's the power of, first and foremost, philosophy. So John Paul II, Love and Responsibility, he talked a lot about the education of love. Mm-hmm. And he talked about the potential in educating man and woman in the great power, but also the great responsibility that comes with loving another human being, specifically within the sexual sphere. Mm-hmm. And yet also, he, in his last chapter, Sexology and Ethics, he wrote the best thing I've read on sexual ethics thus far. And he's not ignorant of nor skipping around the truly scientific data related to sexology and pleasure. Mm-hmm. And in that chapter, what I especially love is he brings it back to, at the core of it, and this is what I realized with him, was that his fight against contraception was for the sake of woman. And what I mean by that is, he did not want woman, because of some desired freedom from pregnancy, to lose what would be almost like her superpower, which we're talking about before, like this interior, this personal subjectivity, at the expense of man's desires. And so he spoke directly to the man, that man does not have a right to simply use woman for sexual pleasure at a whim, right? Or even if it's his wife, you can't just expect from her certain things. He said that what sex needs to be, if it's truly a communion of persons, is something that's built up every single day, little by little. Mm-hmm. He said you need to create a culture of love, right? And this is like people say, sex begins in the kitchen. What they mean is, like, if a woman sees her husband like helping clean the kitchen or helping take care of the kids, that's not some kind of like feminine role. He's offering his strength on behalf of his family, but that gives the woman a sense of protection and security and love, and it opens up her heart, that interior place of her heart, to know you're not just using me for sex. Yeah. Right? You love all of me. You want to support all of me. And in that specific place, what I love is that he talks about the woman's right to tenderness. He says that man owes to woman, and this is what I think is where he would come back to Margaret with kind of what you're saying with her pushback, and he'd say, Margaret, I get it. I know. But if we keep doing what we've done, we're going to keep getting what we've got. So this is going to still be happening in some way, shape, or form. The only way we can change it is if we start with the younger generation, and we have to start educating in the truth. Mm-hmm. And say that man has a responsibility to be tender with woman, especially in the sexual sphere. Not because she's fragile, not because she can't handle the truth or things, but he would say that it's because actually she is the one who, within sex and then the potential and resulting pregnancy and motherhood, she gives of her body in so many taxing and serious ways that the only just response to woman in response to those things is to be tender with her, mm-hmm. but especially within the act, and I wish I could show you and your listeners, like there's a book that Margaret Sanger wrote around 1925, 1926. It was called Happiness and Marriage. And it honestly, if you put them side by side, put happiness and marriage next to sexology and ethics, that last chapter, 80% of it, they say the same thing.
Wow.
Margaret Sanger literally, and this is why I think he would be able to still get her to listen, and she would at some way listen, because he would acknowledge that men have a responsibility too, and he's not giving them an easy pass. Yeah. He would say they too need to be educated, but also they need to be educated in the sense of that you're not an animal.
Yeah.
And that's so what she said. Like she said, don't come to the act with brute force. Don't come to the act expecting.
Yeah.
Like that's why your wife's going to feign a headache. It's because she's tired of you just demanding this of her and she feels used.
Yeah.
You don't want her to feel used. Well, then stop using her. You know, like you need to love all of her. So she talks about the building up and the beauty of a couple of monogamy. I mean, I know this is wild. I was like, Margaret, you wrote this, but like the building up in monogamy, you get to learn each other, and over time you get more comfortable with each other. And then sex, it's like a life that flowers and blossoms through an increased knowledge of the other person, their preferences, what they like, how they feel, you know, and all of this is based on reality. And I think that's what John Paul II would land on in the midst of a very intense debate. Yes. He would say, you know, freedom can only be lived in the limits of reality, Margaret. What's reality telling us?
Yeah. And as you're talking, you know, I could see John Paul challenging Margaret lovingly, saying, you would agree with me that the real core problem here is a lack of tenderness towards the woman, of understanding of her state of affairs, the challenges she's under, and how much she can possibly bear. So if the real core issue is a lack of tenderness in the realm of sexuality towards the woman, isn't it the pill that gives the man a pass? Because it would allow that man to still come home from work a little tipsy, expecting more than ever his marital rights upon the woman. And now, how can she refuse? Because before she could maybe at least appeal to some goodwill in his heart of, I can't have another kid, I'm going to go crazy. Now that excuse is off the table. Now it's like, what reason could you possibly have to say no to me? It's not like you can get pregnant. And so the man, in a sense, becomes free of the demand to be tender because, well, I mean, if you've got somebody who could get pregnant from one act of intercourse, hopefully any decent guy would realize, well, that's a pretty serious thing, you know. But once you get that thing off the table, it's like, I would tend to see the men exercising much less tenderness toward the woman. And this is what I've seen in my ministry. I remember meeting a high school boy, and he said, oh yeah, like when we know girls are on the pill at our school, it's almost like they have a sign on them that just says open for business. They just see them as so much more, they should just be constantly sexually available. And if they're holding out, it's like, well, what's your good reason? It certainly can't be pregnancy. Yep. And so I think if John Paul were to kind of appeal to like, hey, maybe we want the same thing, but isn't throwing the pill at this problem like trying to put out a bonfire by throwing a gallon of lighter fluid on the thing. And, you know, a sociologist, I remember a study put out by the Kinsey Institute years ago was really interesting. They talked about the sexual hookup culture on college campuses. And it was kind of a meta-analysis of all these different universities where they asked kids questions about, you know, how do you feel after hookup? Wouldn't you rather prefer a traditional romantic relationship? And it's a really interesting study. But towards the end, it talks about where has this hookup culture come from? And the answer to them was contraception. And we've discussed this on the show in prior episodes, but the argument was based on evolutionary biology that within any species, whichever sex has the longer reproductive rate tends to be more choosy with their sexual partners. And so within a human species, the female reproductive rate is the longest. I mean, it's 9 months of gestation, then you have lactation and so on, whereas the man's reproductive rate can be all of 5 minutes, and that's it. And so as a result, the man will be much less choosy in who his sexual partner is, whereas the woman stands to lose a lot more from a poor reproductive decision with a mate perhaps that's unable to provide for her and protect her from an evolutionary biology perspective. And so they said what the pill in effect did was give women the reproductive rates of men, and as a result, frankly, nobody's choosy. And this is not empowerment to women, as we can see. And so I think if John Paul were to say, hey, look, Margaret, I really hear you, I feel for that woman, but shouldn't we be educating these boys to be into men who are tender towards women instead of masculinizing the woman's body in order to accommodate the man's lust so she doesn't just end up with another baby? Because the problem isn't just the presence of a baby. The problem is the presence of a woman who's being used. And contraception does not alleviate that problem. It exacerbates the problem. And so ultimately what you're proposing here isn't Catholic sex education. It's Catholic education in human sexuality. It's a more education of the human person, their virtues, the characters, not simply diagrams of this is what that's for, although there's an age-appropriate way to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Because, you know, and that's why there's a way to even do it. It would have a different component to it if it's in a Catholic school versus a public school. But the philosophy piece, I mean, so much of his work in Love and Responsibility, it's philosophical. It's just talking about what's just to another person. Like, what do we owe others? And the most authentic response to human person is love, and I think it's completely what you just said, is that is where that they would agree, though, because John Paul II always said, if you are not responsible, you do not love them, right? Like, the more you appreciate the value of the other person, the more true love there is. And then therefore, the more responsibility you will take. And to all those women too, because I think, sometimes, and what I learned in the research too, is there's also a lot of women who they want to be on the pill because A, it's easy, and B, they think they have one because they can have as many, quote, sexual experiences as men, and I think the reality there is, it's not that everyone's going to agree with all the points that I'm making, but I think if we really have honest conversations with one another, like, is that what we really, really want? Because honestly, then that means I'm running the rat race in the sexual sphere to be like man is in the sexual sphere, that I can have sex and just walk away. And that might feel good for a moment, like maybe I've won something, but like, have I? So that's why I love what you just said. I really enjoy, I think it's from the Austin Institute, The Economics of Sex. It's like a 10-minute video on YouTube. I've used that in some of the classes I've taught. And even when I was campus minister at Louisiana State University and different things, like talking with the students there or talking with my high school girls or talking with my students now at Loyola, it doesn't mean everyone's going to agree with me or us on any of this, but when you present to them, hey, education is an opportunity for you to be formed as an individual. And I most respect your freedom if I give you the complete truth. Yeah. So in terms of sex education, I'm not, and even in a class I had yesterday, I mean, I'm at a Catholic university, but the kids live in the culture we live in. They're coming from all over the place, right? And most of the kids in my class, I don't believe they are Christian. And I'm looking at them and I'm just saying, like, you can tell if I'm making stuff up. You will listen to me if I tell you the truth. And I'm going to tell you the truth right now from a Christian ethical perspective. It would be that you are not an animal. You are not depending completely upon your impulses. You have rationality. It is a powerful tool. It is connected to your freedom. And you have an inner place that you have a subjective experience and you're living an objective reality. But you have to find a way, like I have to find a way to integrate those truths, right? And when it comes to sex, like, I can't make sex what I want it to be all the time. Like, sex, there's an objective reality to sex and to how the bodies come together and to the potential that comes with it. And this isn't like you just need to deal with the consequences, like sex leads to babies. Like, yeah, that's obvious, but it's more than that. It's saying, but don't we all want sex to be more than just leading to babies? We want it to be, in addition to that, we want it to be about human love, right? Yeah. But if we can't educate men and women on what love is, because people are like, you can't teach on love. Like, what is love? It's so ephemeral. I'm like, no, love is responsibility. Love is, I have so many goods in front of me and I can deny myself at times for the sake of the greater good. And like my students who are 18, 19, 20 years old, they know what I'm saying. I'm able to look at them and say, you guys know, I mean, I looked at them yesterday in class and I was like, you guys know the effects of pornography upon your relationships. You're living it. Is it making it better or worse? Yeah. And I'm like, and that's what a man of virtue is. A man of virtue, it doesn't even have to be a theological virtue sense. I mean, just philosophical. Like, a man of virtue is someone who over time with his habits chooses the greater good. And the greater good is for the sake of the woman you either love now or the woman you hope to love in the future, right? You're not going to give into something like pornography, or you're not going to look at her and say, hey, what kind of contraception are you taking? Like, isn't that the most romantic thing ever? Like, hey, you're right? And you're like, what? And so my argument is,
it's not a pickup line, it's a put down line.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, my sense is, if we want to find this middle ground, I went back to, there was a work by a sociologist, Kristen Luker, and she wrote a book, When Sex Goes to School. And she basically did this sort of survey of 5 different cities around the U.S., their experiences with sex education, what they were teaching, what the parents felt. And she said, look, on both sides, they both have something to offer. The comprehensive sex education side has something to offer. The abstinence-only side has something to offer. She says, but her conclusion at the end was, what I don't understand is why aren't we just telling kids the truth? And the truth is that this is not a debate over facts. It's a debate over values. That's what we're debating. what is the value of sex? What is the value of love? What is the value of woman? What is the value of pleasure? What is the value of parenthood, right? What is the value of relationships? What is the value of happiness? And I need to, as a human person, I need to order those. Because if sex is at the top, then I'm going to make all my decisions in line with that. Yeah. But if relationship and honesty and love is at the top and sex comes under that, then I'm going to order my decisions in line with that. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
And so that's what I mean is like taking that philosophy of an education in love and integrating it with the comprehensive sex education side. What they have going for them is they're giving kids the truth about science. Now, some of the ways that they say certain things are okay, I wouldn't agree with, but the sense is it's better to give them something than nothing at all, because our children are going to the internet to have their sex education. It's either pornography or it's videos. I mean, Planned Parenthood now has a bot. You can type any question you want about sex and sexuality, and it will answer you. So, because sometimes, when I first started this work 15 years ago, when I graduated high school, and I was like helping with a sexual integrity program, and I'm like, what did I know then? I don't know, but I knew something, but it's grown since, right? But I remember people then making the argument, but maybe we shouldn't tell our kids this. Like, maybe it's too much information. They can misuse it. And now in 2023, I'm like, everybody, look, where we are now is they have access to so much and every kind of information. If you don't tell your children about sex, someone else will. So even if you don't feel like you know everything, that's okay. Talk to them about it. You can humbly admit you don't know everything, but give them the honest truth about the fact that their bodies are powerful and their love can be powerful, and they're not meant to just like survive in this world, but that their actions, if you love them, you tell them your actions have consequences. And before you get into these moments where it's all hot and heavy and everything's like intense and we can all understand pleasure and things like that, we need to, as human beings, right? That's what education is. It forms us so that I'm actually authentically free to choose based on the truth, not just on my emotions, right? It doesn't mean I obliterate my emotions, but an authentic sex education says, here's the scientific reality of your bodies, both men and women. And it's glorious to learn about. I mean, it's fascinating and it's incredible. And God made it so that woman isn't always fertile. But in the context of marriage, right, that creates this free space of exploration and love in a sacred bond between man and woman, that the woman is safe to explore with him because he's taken responsibility for her, versus for high school and college when there isn't that sacred bond and there isn't that promise of responsibility. If anyone's going to get hurt most, it's going to be the woman. So it's not just the science, it's also the philosophy, because what we're seeing now, and one of the hardest things for me to watch on the news is there are so many good men out there, right? There are so many good men. But if we don't educate our young men on the reality that, for example, a woman who's drunk, she cannot consent to sex. Yeah. What are you doing? The rape culture, it is completely uncalled for. Like, that is where Margaret Sanger and John Paul II would both be rolling up their sleeves, like they would be like, this is hell. Like, this is atrocious. Like, we need to educate our men in responsibility. And we also need to educate our women. But that's the piece that I think Margaret would be reacting against, that John Paul II would understand and want to work with her to move forward, is like, I'm not saying that it's just women taking responsibility for their bodies. He'd say, I'm with you, Margaret. This is also an education, and men need to take responsibility for their bodies. They are not just their sexual impulses. And he says this in his work, The Acting Person, that man has two kinds of acts, what happens to man and man acts. Yeah. What happens to men is sexual arousal in any number of ways. It's very different than for women. Praise God. That's how God made them. Okay, great. But that does not determine your masculinity or your manhood. What determines your manhood in that moment and that experience of arousal or attraction or whatever it might be, right? Lining that moment of subjective experience up with objective reality. There's a woman in front of me. She is good. Am I dating her? Am I married to her? Is she married to someone else? Is she real, or is she on a screen? Is she pixelated? Like, whatever it might be, what is the objectively loving thing I can do in response to this very real woman who has her own story and her own inner world that is not mine to possess? Yeah. Right? You're not to dominate women, John Paul II would say. You are to respect her, to encourage her, to love her. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's why he gives us that, his personalistic norm, which is kind of the heart
Yes.
of love and responsibility, that the
Yeah.
person is a good to which the only proper and adequate response is love. And if we're not teaching boys, adolescent boys, that in elementary school, I mean, you've got a monster on your hands by the time that
Exactly.
kid's 18 years old. I don't care how safe their sex is. You have a monster on your hands. When you divorce values from education and human sexuality, and it just becomes about techniques and anatomy, I
Yeah.
mean, it's a dumpster fire at that point. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's, I think, been a huge myth that, okay, well, the comprehensive sex ed, which sounds great. Hey, it's comprehensive as opposed to narrow-minded. So it's really it has a rhetorical bias to that term.
Yeah.
And abstinence only. It's just the absence of
Yeah.
something. So these words are just loaded with rhetorical bias, from the safe sex folks. They're the ones who coin those phrases, where it's really more contraceptive education and chastity education are the proper terms. But there's been this myth that the sex ed stuff, comprehensive sex ed, that's where the information is. Whereas the abstinence approach, chastity, it's just devoid of information. When in reality, I think the truth of what needs to be happening is the opposite, that we're giving kids so much information about human sexuality in an age-appropriate way, that the information that they're seeing at Planned Parenthood be like, whoa, why did they never tell us this? Why did they not mention not just the side effects of the pill and how the lawsuits and all that stuff and the motives behind it and the big pharma and all that. No, not just that stuff, but just the understanding of my own body that's missing in sex education. It's just like, oh, NFP, that's the rhythm method. That doesn't work. Let's go on to the next thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how much it's covered in a lot of marriage prep courses, in sex ed. And so some people have said, well, we should be teaching fertility awareness methods to Catholic kids long before they get married. And other people say, oh, no. If you teach them how their fertility works, they're going to go run out and they're going to just have all this intercourse during non-fertile times, and they're going to abuse this knowledge of natural family planning. So before we wrap up, can you rebut that claim that if single Catholics are educated in fertility awareness methods prior to the period of engagement just before marriage, this immediate marriage prep, that's a dangerous education to give adolescent, especially female girls? Can you help debunk that?
Absolutely. So this is my shtick. I love this thing, talking about this, right? And I love what you just said to introduce my answer would be essentially what I would argue is this third way for sex education, integrated sex education, is it's exactly that. It's chastity education that's not afraid of science. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Fertility awareness methods. In my experience, so I started charting when I was 20 years old, and now I'm 33. And I became a Creighton model practitioner. I've worked with high school students learning their cycles. I work with college women. I've worked with married couples, engaged couples. I've taught it at my college classes. I work with medical students who want to learn more about this. I will tell you, number one response is, wow, really? Like, our bodies do that? There's this awe and there's this wonder. It's powerful. It's so cool.
Yeah.
And that was my experience when I was 20. I saw a particular slide in the introductory session that showed the difference between the estrogenic type mucus, which is like channels for the sperm to swim up, and then the mucus produced by progesterone, which is like a brick wall.
Yeah.
And I literally in a room of people I did not know, and I was like, wow, that's so cool. And then I was like, sorry, but that inspired me. Like, wait, there's something bigger going on in my own body as a woman that I'm not in control of all the time, but I can come to understand. And so then respect that reality. Right. And I recently, this past semester, I piloted a curriculum I'd written in the context of vocations that did teach fertility awareness. So I had the girls chart their cycles for 3 months. And I wrote a letter to the parents. And honestly, in some providential way, no one was upset about it, which I was kind of shocked by. But I think because I came from the context of, look, as parents, you're the primary educators. You are the ones that get to choose how this information is siphoned to your child, right? But I'm letting you know transparently, this is my research, this is what I've done. And I would argue that instead of us being afraid of science, what we should be afraid of is either nothing at all or erroneous science, like stuff that's not factual, right? And when John Paul II was in his pontificate, he wrote about the need for, he said that sex education, it should not be something that's just like a one and done. You know, he said, and really he called it vocation preparation, which opens it up to loving human beings in whatever we're ultimately called to throughout our lives, right? And he said there's remote vocation preparation when we're a child. We learn basic values, like we share, you know, we don't take from other people, we don't steal, we don't lie, you know. And then there's proximate in adolescence, and then there's immediate. And immediate is in the period of engagement, right? We have a particular goal, I'm moving towards marriage. Now, my experience as a Create Model practitioner was that oftentimes brides would call me about a month before their wedding because Father so-and-so said, hey, it's time for us to learn NFP. And I, as a practitioner, would think, this is cruel. Like, I'm supposed to teach you in 1 month, which if we're lucky, you'll get one cycle.
Yeah.
Something that then for the rest of your life, you're supposed to be confident in how it works. That's unjust. Yeah. So what I go back to in my argument is that the perfect place for this, quote, integrated sex education, so a chastity education that's illuminated and taken further by science, right, is in this proximate time frame in adolescence, when he says we need to be teaching them, and he says in Love and Responsibility that young people need to be taught that they do not need to be afraid of these responses in their bodies of biological phenomena of sexual arousal. They don't need to be afraid of it. But the only way they're going to not be afraid of it is if they're given the truth about it. Yeah. And the tool that we have at our hands to give young people the truth about their bodies and about sex, and the thing that will only take chastity to the next level, I would say, is science. And fertility awareness methods specifically. I think it's the gold standard for a woman to learn about the potential, the power, and the goodness and glory of her actual body as it is that God made it in such a way that at times she has her period, at times she's dry when she wipes and looks at the tissue, at times there's cervical mucus. Oh, there's different kinds of mucus. Oh, I can learn. It's like when I teach it to my girls, I explain, like, you have a diary. This is your biological diary. And all those emotions you're experiencing that you feel like you're not in control of, well, guess what? For a lot of you, they typically freak out right before you start your period. You don't have to be like enslaved to your emotional experience. And that's Edith Stein coming in, right? That's someone else I leaned on, is that if we're going to educate women, we need to educate them that they're not to be just like, whatever my emotion is, I am. That's not what it is that they have the capacity to order their emotions. And that's hard work. That's discipline. I'm not negating that. But I can't tell you how many clients I had for Creighton that I would show them their chart. I would give them a PMS symptom chart, and I would tell them to put down, like, okay, emotions, migraines, cravings, insomnia, whatever. They'd come in the next time, whenever they would come in after some kind of like emotional roller coaster, and they would look at me and they'd say, wait, I'm not crazy, am I? And I'd be like, no, you're not. You're a human being. And part of your humanity as a woman is that you have beautiful hormones that are meant to cycle. But I can't tell you how many women it gives them like a relief, because it's not something happening to me then. It's something I experience, but I get to choose through my freedom how I respond to it. And so fertility awareness, it's not the thing that we should be afraid of to give to women and men, because I teach young men too. And like, they're just like, honestly, you want to know what it teaches young men? If we want to talk about men, it teaches them respect. Yeah. I can't tell you how many guys would come in sometimes and they'd be like, whoa, I didn't know your body could do that. That's so cool, because my body doesn't do that, Yeah. And I think, of course, the enemy always wants us to be tempted to fear. But the reality is, like, we do not need to be afraid of love. And if this is a component of human love, then God has given us a very great gift in the power of science, and in the power of fertility awareness. So in short, everything I just said, to debunk that, I would say we have at our fingertips a very powerful tool. And just like with us in the garden, God the Father gave us these gifts, and he gave us directions, and he said in his plan, do this, don't do this. Out of love for you, I entrusted to you, but you're free. And just like God does not go against the freedom of his children, so too for us, how are we respecting their freedom if we keep the information from them out of fear? we're not respecting them. We're actually, honestly, what we're doing is we're keeping them away from growing and maturing. Like we're the one, we're in a sense, we're like pushing down the great potential in them, and I think I understand the fear. It's very, very real. But I think with the culture, and here's the mercy of God, right? The culture's, everything's exploding, right? And it's not like new in the history of time. This happens, right? But our current explosion, around sexuality and things like that, what a better time for us to have an honest conversation about the differences in our bodies and the power of our bodies. There's quite a lot of confusion going around.
Yeah.
Maybe what we could do is go back to, I hate to say it, but honestly, go back to the basics. The thing is, I live in a first world country, and I work with so many women who have no idea how their bodies work. That's a shame.
Yeah.
If we want to educate women, if we want to honor women, if we live in a truly first world country, then we should give to women the very basic knowledge about how their bodies work, and then they're free to choose in relation to their objective realities. And that is where, to full circle, bring it together. That's where Margaret Sanger and John Paul II, I think, they may not end being best friends. They may not end agreeing on everything. But Margaret and John Paul II, I think, would both say, this is something worth honoring. What are the ways that we can help women to remain free to actually choose in truth and how her body actually works without having to change who she is for the man or for sex or for whatever, that she gets to remain who she is, because otherwise we lose a great gift. We lose out on womanhood. We lose out on who she is in her essence. Woman doesn't need to become something other than who she is to be free. Her freedom is something within, right? That's shapey too. It's not this external thing I need to go conquer and I grab it and now it's mine. My freedom is actually, it's from within me.
Yeah.
And I have the power to choose. And with fertility awareness, my freedom is honored and I'm able to choose in reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but John Paul's core belief was that freedom exists for the sake of love. That's why it exists. It exists to be given away.
So glad you brought that up.
When I think about this dialogue between them, I think John Paul would really try to reaffirm in her that I agree with you. The problem is not information. The real danger is the lack of information, because if we're not informing the young women and men on the beautiful way that their bodies are created, you end up with young women buying medication because they see some pharmaceutical commercial that says, hey, want to get rid of those pesky periods? Yep. Aren't those annoying to have every month? Well, guess what? You don't need to have them. Like, it's like this malfunction, some glitch in your body that you could just erase so you don't have to worry about all that stuff.
It's a disease, according to a lot of things out there. Yeah.
Yeah. So a lack of information makes one girl run in that direction. Then a lack of information, if you're not charting. I was driving around with a husband a couple of days ago, and he was talking about how he and his wife were charting, and then they were able to see something was off. And then they took the chart to the obstetrician or gynecologist, and he's like, yeah, I think you're right, something's off here. It turned out she had ovarian tumors, and all of that became evident because they were physically holding in their hands the reproductive cycle. I mean, like you said, this biological diary, the value of that is extraordinary, that they're able to present it, and he's able to say, yep, something's off. It was able to treat her with the surgery, get rid of the tumors. And so without that, I mean, the pill would just mask all of that. There's no way you'd pick up on any of that stuff if it's just buried underneath all these hormones. And so, maybe at the end of the day, at the conversation, like you said, they might not see eye to eye on anything, but I think Margaret would walk away from that conversation feeling very heard and then very lovingly challenged. By a man, this idea that, you'd brought up, well, gentlemen don't exist, real men aren't out there. She'd be walking away like, wow, this is a glitch in the matrix. Like there's reverence, it's possible. And it's such an attractive thing. Like, what if we could just educate that misogynistic husband when he was 14 years old to read the way he relates to women in his imagination and the deepest movements of his heart? Wouldn't that be such a better solution than chemically castrating women by the tens of millions? And if at the end of the day, what we want is reverence and for women to be truly free, there's no other path than knowledge rooted in what it means to be a human person made in the image and likeness of love. So
exactly. And, if I can just share at the end to say that, my argument here is that the Catholic Church has a lot to learn and grow in terms of our potential for vocation preparation.
Mm-hmm.
But also, if anyone's listening to this and you're in the medical field, like this is, because you brought that up, that this is why I argue, if it's not even a religious conversation, if it's just a medical conversation, this to me opens up the possibility for exactly what you just shared about with your friend. It's such a great form of preventative medicine.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many stories like that a woman, it's not just, oh, I'm experiencing these things and they have no connection. It's like the chart grounds her, or whatever, she's charting on the app. It doesn't matter. It's like it grounds her into, hey, doctor, you're participating in your medical care now because you know your body. Like it's your body. And so if anyone's interested, I encourage you to look into these methods like Create, Model, and FEM. Those are two that I love, but there's Family of the Americas, there's Symptothermal, there's Couple to Couple League, there's Marquette, and different women. I tell people, I'm like, look, I don't care what method you use, like, because different seasons of life, I think you might have different needs and different preferences, but don't be afraid to learn them. But medical professionals, like you can give a great and powerful tool to your patients and to those who are learning from you if you're open to this. And my last point would be what you just said right before the medical stuff, Jason, is that was the point I came to in my dissertation was I realized that Margaret Sanger, her end was always arguing for freedom. And John Paul II was always saying, no, don't stop there.
No.
My ultimate end is not freedom. My ultimate end is love. So let's keep going because the end I wanted to get to is only possible through the means of authentic freedom.
Yeah. And that's one of the beautiful things you learn through NFP, that it doesn't exist simply to postpone and delay pregnancy, because sometimes responsible parenthood means having more kids. Sometimes that is responsible parenthood. And a lot of people, like uber Catholics, might say, well, NFP isn't truly Catholic. It's just a Catholic type of contraception, and it's really not Catholic. Well, NFP could be abused, no doubt, through selfish motives. But we need to understand the Catholic understanding of natural family planning, fertility awareness methods is not simply something to just block pregnancy with equal efficacy of some of the contraceptive methods. No, I even heard a great point from someone we had on podcast a while ago that some people say, well, NFP can be used in a contraceptive way. And they said, no, it can't. NFP could be used in a selfish way, but it's not contraceptive. It's not an act against conception. And so we've got to understand that this gift that has been given and the way God has created a woman's body isn't exclusively to postpone pregnancy, isn't exclusively to screen for endometriosis or polycystic ovarian syndrome. This is also to understand that, hey, maybe we're called to welcome more life. And the reverence you learn for through natural family planning for the body of the woman flows into a reverence for God's bigger plan of human sexuality, the family, and children. Because if we can be generous with him in the bedroom, in our prayer lives, in the sexuality, it's not just going to end there. It's going to flow throughout the rest of the family, strengthen that vocation. And that's why couples who use natural family planning have a divorce rate that's under 4%. And part of that is causation, part of that is correlation, because these, typically they're more devout couples, more kids, and those things contribute to a lower divorce rate. But there is a causative effect of natural family planning in strengthening marriages, because if it's being used properly, it's increasing the man's tenderness toward the woman. So it's not family planning is her deal. You take the pill, you take the shot. This becomes our deal, which although it does create challenges sometimes in marriages, it kind of brings to the surface sometimes an insufficiently developed virtue of chastity. And it's easy to blame NFP. Well, that's the problem. That thing's caused the problems. Our method is that you're not always available. No. This is the thing that's bringing the real problems to the surface if we have the courage and humility to acknowledge that and let God heal these deeper wounds. Can create, John Paul II said that the fullness of the intimacy of persons. So, yeah.
And I think, isn't it beautiful? Everything you just described, it's like this interwoven complexity of like the realities. And I'm like, isn't that woman?
Yeah.
Like,
big tapestry.
As a compliment, it's like this interwoven complexity of, and this is what I think our cycle, this is just my personal thought, but our biological fertility cycle as a woman, it's sort of a microcosm of, in a sense, the life that God has given us that there are seasons, there are seasons that are in a sense more fertile than other seasons. And there are seasons that require more work than other seasons. But like if woman can remain faithful to that place, like woman reveals to the world through her being, and that includes her body, like the power of the fact that like life is a consistent change, but the change isn't the problem. Like you're saying, the challenge isn't the problem. It's the invitation, right? To become the fullest version and the most honestly like whole, happy version of myself is not this one day I've arrived. It's this, as John Paul II says, the task of integration is a task of a lifetime because it takes your whole life, right? Yeah. And then, so everything we've talked about today, it's a deeper invitation, a very difficult at times, but very real and fertile and powerful invitation into life in abundance. And written into my very body, written into our very bodies.
And so I'd wrap up pointing people to resources. I'll give one, you can give whatever. I would say to our listeners, go read Love and Responsibility by St. John Paul II, because besides all this stuff, he dives into chastity and the resentment toward chastity, why it's so easy to want to tear down the challenge so that we can kind of lightheartedly pass it by, preferring what's more comfortable and convenient, treating the demands of human love as if they're unhealthy and unnecessary and overly rigid and like chastity's the problem. That's a lot easier than being like, I got some work to do in here. And so if you haven't read Love and Responsibility, do it. I wish I could invite everybody who's listening. We're doing a hike this summer. We just announced on social media up in the mountains near Aspen. We're going to spend 4 days backpacking in the wilderness with 2 priests, and I'll be teaching love and responsibility as we go through all these campsites. And we posted it, online like, hey, you guys want a camping trip? We had to shut it down within like 24 hours, 48 hours, because we got 10 times as many registrations as we could even possibly bring on the trip. But to me, it shows that thirst for people like, I want to be challenged in love. And so that's what Love and Responsibility does. Where can people, any, things that you'd recommend people read, or where can people get in touch with you or the good work that you're doing, or learn more about fertility awareness methods?
Thank you. So, first I would say 100% agree with you. Love and Responsibility. I'm like, if I could give that to every married couple, read it, guys. I also would recommend John Paul II's letter to women and or his encyclical on women. Just if you want to go deeper into what does the church actually teach about women, that's a rich place to read those things. You can reach me. My email address is Dr. Sarah Denny, DrSarahDenny @gmail.com.
SARAH.
SARAHDENNY. Okay. Exactly. Thank you for clarifying. I'm working on my website right now, so it's in progress, but I started a business called What Women Are, and I'm hoping to put out a curriculum soon, and I'd love to publish my dissertation eventually in time as more of a lay version for just any woman who wants to learn more about her body. And, if you're a woman or a man and you're interested in these things, like please, 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 find someone in your area. Just Google your area plus Creighton model or FEMM, FEMM. If you're a woman, you can take out your phone right now and you can download the FEMM app. It's free. Yeah. And you can just start like logging in things, look around. And it's kind of, I like it because it's educational. It'll prompt you every day with like your hormones are probably doing this based on what you're charting. I encourage you to do that. But my website's whatwomenare.com, and my email address again is drsarahdenny @gmail.com.
Well, Dr. Denny, thank you for coming on the show. I've extremely enjoyed the conversation. I know the listeners have as well. So keep up the wonderful work. God bless you, and thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. God bless all of you.
Thank you.